The storm took the power out at 11:47 p.m., and Julian Ferris knew this because he was staring at the numbers on his phone when the screen went black along with everything else. He lay still in the dark, listening to the wind try to take the roof off his father's cottage one nail at a time. Wren's Point wasn't really a village. It was 4 houses, a jetty, a defunct lighthouse, and a general store that sold bread on Tuesdays and Fridays if the ferry made it across. Julian had grown up here and left the second he could, and now, at 31, he was back, not because he wanted to be, but because his father had died in March and left him a house full of dust, debt, and a leaking roof that someone needed to either fix or set on fire. He'd chosen fix. Mostly. Which was why, 3 weeks ago, a stranger named Kit Halloran had knocked on his door holding a toolbox and a letter from the mainland contractor's office, and Julian's life had gotten complicated in a very specific, very inconvenient way. Kit was here to repair the lighthouse, a separate contract, something to do with the historical trust, but the only place to stay on the point was Julian's house, because the point had no inn, no hostel, and no patience for a man who might have to sleep in his van in October. So Julian had given him the second bedroom. Told himself it was temporary. Told himself the low hum he felt every time Kit laughed at something on the radio was just the unfamiliar feeling of another person in the house again. Told himself a lot of things, actually. The wind screamed. Somewhere downstairs, something fell over. Julian pulled the blanket to his chin and tried not to think about how the second bedroom's window didn't latch properly, how the whole cottage was really just one long room with walls added later almost as an afterthought, how anyone half asleep and stumbling in pitch dark might, quite reasonably, walk into the wrong door. He was still thinking about it when the wrong door opened. Julian didn't wake up so much as arrive at consciousness already startled, aware of warmth where there shouldn't be warmth, weight where there shouldn't be weight. An arm. A leg. The specific, unmistakable shape of another human being asleep beside him, breathing slow and even, one hand loosely curled against Julian's chest like it had always belonged there. For 4 full seconds, Julian did not move. Gray light was easing in around the curtains, later than midnight, then, much later, and it was enough to see the outline of Kit Halloran's face 6 inches from his own, utterly unbothered, utterly asleep, one eyebrow permanently arched even in dreams. Kit. Nothing. Kit. Julian said it a little louder, and Kit's eyes opened slowly, unfocused, the particular confusion of a man who has no idea what continent he's on. You're in my bed. Kit blinked at the ceiling. Blinked at Julian. Looked down at his own hand, which was very much resting on Julian's chest, and made a small sound that might have been the beginning of an apology or might have been something else entirely. The power went out, Kit said, like that explained anything. It did. My door doesn't stay shut when the wind gets under it. I thought, he stopped. Rubbed his face. I genuinely thought this was my room. It's not. I'm aware of that now, yes. Kit didn't move, though. Neither did Julian. There was a strange, suspended quality to the moment. The storm outside had gone quiet, reduced to a steady patter, and the room held a kind of gray, forgiving light that made it very hard to be embarrassed properly. You could let go of my shirt, Julian said, eventually. Kit looked down at his own fist, found it closed around a handful of Julian's t-shirt, and released it like it had bitten him. Right. Sorry. But he didn't get up. Julian didn't ask him to. Outside, a gull screamed once and went silent, and the tide came in against the rocks the way it had every morning for 10,000 mornings, indifferent to the 2 men lying very still in a small room, both of them awake now, both of them pretending, for just one more minute, that neither of them had noticed how it felt to not be cold for once. Breakfast happened in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable so much as overworked, like both of them were trying too hard to make it seem normal. Kit made the coffee, which Julian noted, because Kit never made the coffee. He usually complained about the cottage's ancient percolator and let Julian do it instead. Today he stood at the counter with his back to the room, shoulders set in the particular way of a man who needed something to do with his hands. So, Kit said finally. That was a thing that happened. It was an accident. I know it was an accident. Kit turned around, and there was something careful in his face, testing the ground before he put his weight on it. I wasn't implying it was anything else. I wasn't implying you were implying. Good. Great. We're aligned. Kit poured 2 mugs, brought one to Julian, and for a second their fingers overlapped on the handle before Kit let go, a beat too slow to be nothing. Julian looked down at the coffee like it might tell him something useful. You didn't move me, Julian said. When you realized. You just stayed. Kit was quiet for long enough that Julian looked up. I was tired, Kit said. Then, more honestly, and it was warm. And I liked it. I'm not going to lie to you about that. Julian's chest did something complicated. He'd spent 8 years in London learning how to be unbothered by men who said things plainly. It was supposed to get easier with practice, not harder, but Kit had a way of saying true things like they cost him nothing, and it kept catching Julian off guard. I liked it too, Julian said, because apparently today was a day for saying true things. Kit smiled, not his usual crooked, joking smile, but something smaller and more real, and might have said something else entirely, except that was the exact moment Julian's foot brushed a floorboard near the pantry door and the board gave a hollow, wrong sound, like there was empty space beneath it that shouldn't have been there. Both men looked down. That's new, Julian said. It took a crowbar, 20 minutes, and Kit's genuine delight at any excuse to use tools to get the board up. Underneath was a shallow space, dry despite the storm, and inside it, a tin box, rust-freckled at the corners, tied shut with garden twine gone brittle with age. Julian sat back on his heels and stared at it the way you'd stare at something that might be a gift or might be a bomb. That's my father's box, he said slowly. I know that tin. He kept fishing tackle in it when I was small. He didn't reach for it. You don't have to open it, Kit said. I do, though. Julian pulled it free of the dust and the twine came apart in his fingers like it had been waiting for exactly this. Inside, photographs gone amber with age, a pressed flower flattened to tissue thinness, and a stack of letters bound with a ribbon that had once been blue. Julian's hands went still on the ribbon. They're not addressed to my mother, he said. His voice had changed register entirely, gone quiet and strange. They're addressed to someone named Robbie. Kit went very still beside him. Say that again. Robbie. Julian looked up, confused by Kit's face, which had gone the pale, careful color of a man bracing for something. Why? Kit sat down slowly on the cold floor next to him, like his legs had made the decision without consulting him. My great-uncle's name was Robert Halloran, Kit said. Everyone called him Robbie. He used to keep the light here. On this island. Before it went automatic in the 80s. He swallowed. He never married. My grandmother used to say it was a shame, that he never found the right girl. The wind, which had finally gone still all morning, chose that exact moment to pick back up against the windows, as if the house itself had been holding its breath and had just now let it go. Julian looked down at the letter in his hand. At his father's handwriting, younger, looser than the handwriting Julian remembered, but unmistakably his, and at the first line, visible even folded. Robbie, I watched the light again last night and thought only of you. Neither man said anything for a long moment. Oh, Julian said finally, very quietly. Oh. They read the letters at the kitchen table because it felt wrong to read them anywhere else, not the bedroom, not the sofa, somewhere neutral, somewhere that could hold whatever came next without it meaning something the two of them weren't ready for yet. There were 11 letters. All from Julian's father, Callum, to a man named Robbie Halloran, spanning 4 years in the early 1970s, when Callum would have been 24 and unmarried and, apparently, desperately, carefully in love with the man who kept the lighthouse. There were no letters back. Whatever Robbie had written, Callum hadn't kept, or hadn't been given permission to keep, or had burned out of fear the way men of that era burn things that could get them arrested, or worse. He married my mother 2 years after the last letter, Julian said, staring at the date. I always thought, I don't know what I thought. That it was just what people did then. Maybe it was both, Kit said gently. Maybe he loved her too. People aren't simple. Did your uncle ever say anything about? Julian gestured at the letters, unable to find the right shape for the question. Never. Not once. He lived here his whole life, alone, and when he died my grandmother said it was such a waste, that a man like that should have had a family. Kit's jaw tightened. He had a family. He just wasn't allowed to say so. Julian looked at the letter in his hands, his father's young, hopeful, terrified handwriting, 40 years old and still warm somehow, still reaching for someone across a table neither of them could see, and felt something in his chest crack open that he hadn't known was sealed. I spent so long being angry at him, Julian said. For never once asking about my life in London. Never once asking he stopped. Who you loved, Kit finished, quietly. Yeah. Julian's eyes were wet now, and he didn't bother hiding it, which surprised him more than the tears did. I thought it was because he didn't want to know. But maybe he already knew exactly what it cost. Maybe that's why he never asked. Kit reached across the table, not dramatically, not like a film, just a hand settling over Julian's the way you'd steady something that was shaking, and Julian let him. I think, Kit said slowly, your father loved my uncle in a house that would have thrown them both out for it. And I think we just woke up in the same bed by accident and neither of us ran. Julian laughed, wet and surprised. That's not the same thing. Isn't it, though? Outside, the storm had finally, entirely passed, and the light coming through the kitchen window had the scrubbed, silver clarity that only follows a very bad night. They spent the rest of that day not talking about it, and talking about nothing else. Kit went back to the lighthouse in the afternoon because the trust's deadline didn't care about ghosts, and Julian sat at the kitchen table rereading the letters until the light went gold and then gray and then gone. He found, in the 9th letter, a single line that undid him more than all the others combined. Someday, Robbie, there will be a world that lets men like us keep the things we love in the daylight instead of the dark. I won't live to see it. I hope someone does. Julian read that line 4 times before he understood he was being handed something, not just a family secret, but a kind of instruction. A door his father had never been able to walk through, held open, 40 years later, for someone who could. When Kit came back at dusk, cold and salt-streaked and smelling of the sea, Julian was standing at the lighthouse door with a lamp in one hand. I want to show you something, Julian said. In the daylight. Well, lamp light. It's the closest we've got. Kit followed him up the spiral stairs to the lamp room, where the great glass lens still sat dark and patient, waiting for a bulb that hadn't been lit in decades, and Julian set the lamp down on the sill and looked out at the black water and the one small light of the mainland, miles off. I want to fix this room properly, Julian said. Not just the structural stuff for the trust. I want to put the letters here. A little plaque, maybe. Something that says who he was. Both of them, who they were, to each other. Kit was quiet for a moment, looking out at the water instead of at Julian, and when he spoke his voice had gone thick. You do that. Put it in writing. In public. I think somebody should, Julian said. Since nobody could, then. Kit turned to look at him, and there in the lamp room, 40 feet above a sea that had kept this particular secret for half a century, he reached over and tucked a piece of windblown hair back from Julian's forehead, a small gesture, unhurried, the kind that means far more than it should. Move over, Kit said. I want to see the mainland light from where you're standing. Julian moved over. Kit stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder, close enough that their coats touched, and neither of them stepped away. 3 weeks later, the Lighthouse Trust sent an inspector who pronounced the tower structurally sound for the first time in a decade, and Kit's contract officially ended, which meant, technically, he had no reason left to sleep in the second bedroom of Julian Ferris's cottage. He didn't leave. Nobody discussed it directly. It simply became true, the way tides become true, the way certain mornings quietly stop being accidents and start being on purpose. On the first properly ordinary morning of the new arrangement, no storm, no dead power, no wrong doors, just an early autumn light coming soft through the curtains, Julian woke to find Kit already awake beside him, propped on one elbow, watching him with the unguarded, slightly ridiculous fondness of a man who has stopped pretending he isn't in love. "You're staring," Julian said, voice thick with sleep. "I am." "Weirdo." "Completely," Kit agreed, and didn't stop. Downstairs, in a frame Julian had bought in the mainland town for exactly this purpose, the 9th letter sat on the mantel where anyone could read it, the line about daylight, about a world that let men keep what they loved without hiding it, framed not as tragedy but as a promise finally kept. Later that week, they would drive the letters out to the lighthouse together and seal them. Along with a small brass plaque, into the restored lamp room wall, where the light, relit for the first time since 1986, thanks to a very stubborn trust grant and one very determined carpenter, would shine out over the water every night from now on. In memory of Callum Ferris and Robert Halloran, who loved each other in the dark, so that we would not have to. But that morning, none of that had happened yet. That morning there was only the small room, the two men, and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of waking up beside someone on purpose. Julian reached over and laced his fingers through Kit's. "Stay," he said. "Not an accident this time. Not a question, either." "Try and stop me," Kit said, and outside, the gulls began their ordinary, unbothered morning racket, and the sea went on being the sea, holding nothing back anymore.